Channel 31 acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land on which this episode was filmed, the Gunai-Kurnai peoples, and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. We extend those respects to the Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nation, the land on which the Channel 31 studios are based.
Hi, I'm Bridie Shepherd, and today on the Eco Show I'm visiting Flannagan Island, where I'll be learning about the landscape here and the great people who are working to conserve it. Let's check it out.
Flannagan Island is a privately owned island just south of Lakes Entrance in East Gippsland, Victoria. It is the very first whole island to be legally protected under a covenant. We have taken a boat over from the mainland today and will be guided by members from Trust for Nature and the East Gippsland Catchment Management Authority to learn about the work they are doing to preserve the island. When we think about conserving land, we don't usually think about private land. Yet Victoria has a high proportion of privately owned land. Over 60% of Victoria's land mass is technically privately owned. And the biodiversity of this land needs to be supported, from the smallest microbe to the biggest eagle. This is where Trust for Nature comes in. They are a not-for-profit organisation whose mission is to work collaboratively with private landowners to protect and preserve their land in perpetuity. Chatting with me today is Paul Harvey.
Hi Paul.
Hello Bridie.
Thank you for meeting with me today.
Pleasure.
Can you tell me a bit about the revolving fund that Trust for Nature has?
Yeah, so the revolving fund came into being in order to provide a constant cycle of conservation investment. The plan behind it is that using philanthropic funding, Trust for Nature buys suitable properties that fit in with our mission, threatened habitat, remnant vegetation, threatened species on it. We'll purchase it, we'll place a conservation covenant on it so it's protected in perpetuity, and it's sold back into the market, aimed at people who share our values. And that then provides this constant cycle of money, because any profits made from the sale go back into the fund. So it just cycles around, and it's just a mechanism that seems to be working very well for us. There is quite a market out there with a lot of people, tree changers, sea changers, who are interested in the sort of properties that we get involved in because of their natural values.
It's really interesting to hear you use economic structures in order to conserve nature.
Yeah.
It seems like it's a very generous thing to sort of give this land up or to protect this land. Mm-hmm. What motivates people to want to protect it when they could develop it for commercial means?
That's true. I think most people that we deal with have a personal connection to the land. Their patch of land is important to them. They're emotionally involved and invested in it. And it is that long-term view of, we all have a certain time on this planet. I love this place, it's important to me. How do I keep it like this? What can I do to make sure that it's not changed in terms of its usage in future? And basically that's where we come in to have that conversation. And we want the people who are engaging with us to be extremely comfortable with what they're doing. And so have plenty of time to think about it and discuss their issues, etc. And so it's important for us to be able to understand what people's concerns are and what their wishes are. What do they see the land looking like in 100 years? It's very important that we understand their particular vision.
And a lot of the land that is owned, has it been passed down through many generations of people?
Yeah, quite often we find that there's that family connection, the family tie. You might be dealing with people who are fourth generation, fifth generation, and this particular patch, particularly on a farm, where you might find 80% of it's given over to production. But there'll always be patches, that remnant patch of the trees, that's where we had the cubbies. And so there's an emotive connection there, which we understand, and that's why they end up giving us a call or dropping us a line saying, can you help me? I don't want this to change in future.
And then they become custodians really of the land.
Absolutely, yeah, it's very much that. It's not our land, it remains theirs. We're there to help, to advise, to assist. Our project work, we try and feed into that, the covenants, ongoing weeds are always an issue. Feral animals are always an issue, especially in this part of the world. So we're there to assist and advise and basically hold the landowner's hand into the future. But it's still their land, and so most people are very committed to the land, and it dovetails very neatly.
We're on a really incredible special island, Flannagan Island. Can you tell us a bit about where we are right now?
Okay, so this is a privately owned island of approximately 77 hectares, or roughly 200 acres, in the middle of the Gippsland Lakes, tucked away in southeastern Victoria. We've been talking to the owners of this island for a couple of years now, who wanted to protect the island into the future for posterity, for when they're no longer around. It being an island, and particularly in its location, it's a really quite unique piece of real estate from our point of view. So once we heard about this, we were delighted to have a chat with the owners and take them through the process of permanently protecting it so that it's always going to be preserved for conservation into the future. And that's an ongoing process that will continue as and when we can find funding to assist us to try and get it back to something like it would have been before it was farmed, which it has been in parts of the island, and grazed by animals. So that sort of interference and modification leaves a legacy. And so we're at the start of that ongoing process to turn it back, but it's happening already. As walking around, things are cropping up now that there's no grazing anymore. It's been left alone, and it will continue to recover, I'm sure.
What animals were grazing on this land?
There has been cattle on here historically, but most recently it was a goat farm, strangely enough, just in the lake. So the goats were brought over on a boat and released and farmed and goated off.
The landowners evacuated the goats from the island around a year ago to allow for plants to naturally regenerate.
How do you get them off the island?
Yes, well, it's an interesting process. There was a goat race built, which is less exciting than it sounds, and it's basically a corral system. And as the goats were introduced to, if you like, a Judas goat, which is basically a leader that leads them on to where you want them to go, a socialised goat. The socialised Judas goat basically got most of the goats into one area where people can then sort of round them up, herd them, and push them through the corral system and onto boats. And then they were boated off. And as far as we can tell, there are no more goats on here. So we hope, but we'll have a look around today. It's going to be interesting to see what crops up, and I can see a lot of plants that are already recovering. A little bit of rain, end of drought, take the goats off, and the process of regeneration starts. And part of our job will be to monitor that and to assist it in any way that we can.
And do you do some work with traditional owners on this land, or on different?
Well, we certainly engage very closely with the local traditional owners. That's the Gunai-Kurnai, representing the 5 clans of their nation. And the registered Aboriginal party around here is known as GLAWAC, the Gippsland Land and Waters Aboriginal Corporation. And so they have their own natural resource management teams, which we work with and engage them. They provide us with advice on cultural heritage issues and that sort of thing.
Whilst filming the Eco Show in the Gippsland Lakes region, our crew chose to stay at Jetty Road Retreat, Nungurna, a secluded lakeside getaway for couples and families with breathtaking waterfront views. To find out more, visit jettyroadretreat.com.au today.
Paul is going to show me around the changes that have occurred in the vegetation since the project began.
So this is one of our more interesting native trees. It's a cherry ballard, native cherry, Exocarpus cupressiformis. The interesting thing about these is that they are semi-parasitical, so they actually feed partly off a host plant. Once they get to this stage of being 5-6 metres high, they're up and away under their own steam. But the way that they begin is that they're nice little pretty red berries here, of which you can eat them. They're bush tucker and full of vitamin C. Yeah. The darker the better. Those berries are eaten by birds. The birds pass through the digestive system, which scarifies the seed and breaks its hard coating. It's a very hard seed. Out it comes from the back end, so it's normally near a tree that the bird's sitting in.
The berries were delicious, but please be careful not to eat the seed or the green segments, as this part of the fruit can be fatal.
Their roots will automatically connect with the root system of the host plant, which in this case is probably a coastal banksia, and they feed off that in some way that isn't very well understood, and it may be symbiotic, and they get to a certain stage and take over. But it's an interesting adaptation that I'm not aware of that many trees in Victoria that would do that. And sadly they are very much adored by the introduced samba deer, which are a plague across southeastern Australia now. They will browse on the adults, so that they will typically graze them off to sort of head height. They'll also be browsing on all the next generation as well. So you won't truly see the effect of a browser like deer for another generation or two, because then when the parent plants fall over, the next generation isn't there, it's already been browsed out. So there goes your cherry ballards. But,
So you've done a good job of getting rid of the goats on the island.
absolutely,
really, because this is
absolutely, because that's
thriving.
why we've seen several cherry ballard babies pop up, and that's what we want. We want more of them because they're getting hammered in the public estate, and so the more that we have growing here, that's fine by us.
And they're delicious as well.
And they're delicious, bush tucker. Yeah.
So this is a big old tree.
It is a big old tree. We love trees like this. Not only are they full of character, but they begin to, as they get older and develop hollows, which takes probably up to 100 years for a eucalypt around here, trees like this forest red gum, as they age and develop hollows, they then take on an extra importance in the landscape because they begin to provide habitat for birds and possums, etc. It's not that there's a shortage of trees, but there's a shortage of an age class of tree, because so many of them have been cut down. For all the replanting that's probably been taking place over the last 50 years, it's still going to take 100 years before you get hollows developing. So where do all those creatures go? Where do the owls go? The little cockies. We were talking about perhaps how old it was. Probably predate colonisation, so we're going back a long time.
Wow.
It's very, very substantial. It looks like it's gone through several iterations where it almost died, nearly hung on, and then shot out another side branch. I mean, and that's probably been growing there for quite a while.
It's beautiful.
It is beautiful, isn't it? That bark's really characterful.
Do you ever hug trees?
All the time.
Okay, shall we?
Yes. There we go.
This project is funded by the Victorian Government for the Gippsland Lakes. Trust for Nature is working closely with state and federal governments, local land care networks, Greening Australia, GLAWAC, and of course the East Gippsland CMA to preserve the area. The island is part of the internationally significant Ramsar-listed Gippsland Lakes, recognised for its environmental value. Sean from the East Gippsland CMA is going to tell me more about the lakes and their significance.
Thanks for meeting with me today, Sean.
No worries.
We're on a beautiful island, sun has just come out. Can you tell me what sort of work you do in the waterways here?
Yeah, so my job is about coordinating the works right across the Gippsland Lakes, helping to pull people together, work with community, agency, not-for-profit agencies like Trust for Nature, and get some real outcomes for the lakes on the ground.
So you work in quite a collaborative manner, is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. So a big part of the work that I do and the work that the Catchment Management Authority does is pulling people together, getting them to identify common priorities and finding opportunities for them to make environmental gains together, and that's particularly important here in the lakes. It's a really big system, it's a really complex system, and people working together we find really generates much better outcomes on the ground and much better outcomes for the environment as well.
Yeah, you've got quite an expansive chunk of land here. So how many islands are in this general area?
Yeah, so there's 4 main islands that run from Lakes Entrance, where we've just started today, through to where we are now on Flannagan Island, and they sit within the Gippsland Lakes, which is one of Australia's biggest inland waterways. Sits within the Gippsland Lakes Ramsar site, which is 60,000 hectares, and the Gippsland Lakes themselves drain over 10% of Victoria. So it's a really big catchment, it's a really big system, and it holds a whole lot of values, not only ecological values, but also really important things for the economy of Victoria and particularly the local area, really important things for like recreational fishing, as well as local tourism as well.
These islands aren't necessarily connected, but they do have a bit of a connection between them, is that right? And there has been some dredging that's gone on in the area. Can you tell us about the dredging?
Permanent entrance in the Gippsland Lakes was established in the mid 1800s, and so that was for passage. So before there was a reliable road network, that was to get things in and out of Melbourne, and this waterway stretches 80 kilometres to the west of us to sail. So it was about passage of freight, essentially. These islands have a connection, and it's often a bit tricky to see, so there might be water between them, but one of the important things about waterways is that the connection is often under the water. So behind us we've got quite extensive seagrass beds, so ecologically these places are really quite connected. Birds can fly between them, fauna can move between them, and plants can move between them, which is a different concept as well. But the important thing is that they're managed as a whole, as a landscape.
So, I mean, I could probably walk down here and taste the water now, but how much of this is salt water versus fresh water? Yeah,
so at the moment, so we're well within the tidal range of the estuary here, so it comes and goes. At the moment, locally, we've had quite a bit of rain, so the lakes are a little bit fresher than what they have been, certainly over the last 3 years. We've had a really quite dry period in East Gippsland and Gippsland generally, so we've been sort of in drought conditions. So at the moment, where we're standing, the water would be quite salty, but that's we're on an incoming tide. So coming outgoing tide, the fresh water will then push down the lake system, but that's, as I said, more related to the rain we've had more recently. But estuaries are a changing system, so you get periods of really salt when it's really dry and you don't have the catchment inflows, and then you'll have periods where they're fresher like we do now, or even in the big floods where the area where we're standing now will be totally covered in water, well and truly, and then the system certainly is very fresh.
So when there's those sorts of changes, does that affect the ecosystem on the land as well?
Yeah, it can do, and certainly in drier periods things are under stress, so everything needs water. Birds, plants, everything that lives here needs some sort of source of fresh water. So in dry conditions things are stressed, and that can certainly impact how they flourish, how they breed. And then in floods, again, things that don't like to be wet get inundated, so that can be a problem as well. The other thing that flooding does is sort of refresh the landscape as well. So we get flushing of salts, we get wetlands filled up that might have been dry for a while. So it's really important to have flooding in the landscape as well, and that's periodic. We can never predict it. You get some big ones, you get some small ones, but it does trigger changes. Not all of them bad, some of them very, very good, particularly for things like frogs that are breeding in wetlands.
Yeah, that was my next question. So if this area is all underwater, what happens to the wildlife that's here? Is there a lot of wildlife? Are they scampering up trees? Are there echidnas in gums?
Yeah, and terrestrial wildlife, I guess flooding provides a real challenge for them, particularly on an island like we are today. You'd be surprised of the resilience of things like kangaroos and others, and most Australian native animals can swim, and swim quite well, even echidnas. So they'll find things are getting a bit wet and head for the higher ground. And behind us, it's not too far a distance to the escarpment, and on the other side of the island as well, it's not too far to some higher ground as well. So terrestrial animals can sort of run for the hills, birds can fly, and then wetland species like to be wet, so that's a good time for them.
And kangaroos can swim as well?
Yeah, they can, yeah. The water on the other side of the island, quite shallow, so for a kangaroo, there'd be a bit of touching the bottom and a little bit of swimming, and they can make their way to solid ground the other way.
Always very, very impressed by all these natives.
Flannagan Island is extremely important because it provides habitat for water birds and migratory shorebirds. Much of the island is covered with swamp scrub and estuarine wetland that are in good condition, but the surrounding woodlands are degraded or cleared. Past goat farming has impacted on the island's plants, and vegetation is only just starting to recover now that they've been removed.
It's a really important part of the world for birds, so both the resident species, so the ones that are here all the time, so our black swans, things like sooty and pied oyster catchers, the hooded plovers, which are an endangered species in Victoria. So those birds are here all the time, and the beaches that you see behind us and the productivity that the lakes provide is really, really important for those. But then in certain times of year, or this time of year where we are, we have our migratory species start to arrive from the northern hemisphere. So things like the bar-tailed godwit, which is quite a striking migratory bird, one of the bigger ones that we see. They fly up to 11,000 kilometres non-stop from the northern hemisphere, and then they'll arrive here in the Gippsland Lakes and other places of the eastern Australian coast to fatten up over summer and then make that return journey to breed. So they are amazing. It's an amazing journey for often very, very small birds.
11,000 kilometres? My geography is not amazing sometimes. How far away is that?
So you're talking about Siberia and Alaska and Russia. So It's a long way. So godwits are unique in that sense in that they fly non-stop. Lots of other migratory birds need to stop on the way to refuel because it is such a long way and they are such small birds. So places like the Yellow Sea in China and other places along what we call the East Australia-Asia Flyway are really important and critical stopovers for these birds on their way here so that they get enough fuel to make the journey, then they spend some time here to refuel and fatten up and then make the journey back to breed in the Northern Hemisphere.
So I imagine that there must be a huge problem if they come to these areas, you know, they've been flying here for hundreds, if not thousands of years potentially, and they find that suddenly there's a development on their land. What happens in those sorts of situations?
Yeah, and that's one of the challenges right along the East Australian coast where coastal development has the potential to impact on species like that. We're very fortunate here in the Gippsland Lakes where there's not that developmental impact, but what we can have is, as I said earlier, tourism is a really important thing. We've got lots of visitors, lots of people in boats, lots of people fishing, swimming, and if you're a migratory bird and you just want to rest, then being disturbed while you're trying to feed or roost can be a real issue. People with dogs unrestrained is also an issue as well. So it's really about giving these guys a bit of a rest while they're here and allowing them to fatten up so that they can make that journey back.
So if I'm coming here as a tourist, I want to hang out on the beach, maybe not on this island in particular, but just in this area, what should I do to make sure that I'm not disturbing any wildlife?
Yeah, so often there's signs that say this is a breeding area. So if there are signs, then obey the signs. Have a look around you. Lots of our resident birds as well as the migratory birds, they build a nest, but it's not a nest as you know. So it's not made of sticks and grass. It's simply a bit of a scrape in the sand. So just pay attention. Look where your feet are. Look where you're setting up your picnic rug or your beach shelter. And if there's birds in the way or there's birds nearby, then maybe have a second thought about where you're going and just limit the amount of disturbance that you're going to cause, but still have some fun.
Try not to play hip hop too loudly
that sort of
on
thing.
the beach.
Yeah.
Had a big change here when the bushfires came through. How did that impact the landscape?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, and I think I'll probably start with community, and that's been the biggest thing. So it's a big impact on the community as a whole, particularly the East Gippsland community, and it was a real challenge over the summer period. Certainly, I think the environmental impacts in the forests to the east were significant. We're starting to see some sort of legacy impacts now in the lakes as well. So water quality is a big thing as we now start to get some rainfall on these catchments that were burnt. That impacts the water quality flowing to receiving waters like the Gippsland Lakes, but also the estuaries further east of here as well.
So when you've got water running off in those affected areas, and so probably a lot of ash coming down, how does that actually impact, I'm asking you to, I guess, nerd out at this stage, but how does that actually impact the wildlife or sort of the underwater ecosystem here?
Yeah, and I guess it's really a question, as it is always, about habitat.
Yep.
So the impact from bushfire runoff is a water quality one. So you have more sediment that comes into the water, and that can smother things. So it can smother things like seagrasses. It can have a physical impact on fish, so it can smother their gills or other invertebrates and other things, so that results in death. But then there's sort of ongoing impacts. So potentially what you can have is a whole lot more sediment and nutrient end up in the lakes, and that can trigger algal blooms when conditions are right in typically the warmer and the stiller months as well. So that's a real potential thing, and it's often a little bit of a wait and see sort of game to see what the actual impact will be, and we're waiting this summer to see where that will end up. And we're continuing to work with our community and work in priority areas to try and address those issues.
So when we talk about ecological restoration, is it difficult trying to decide which period we want to restore it back to? Is it pre-colonial times? Is it 50 years ago? How do we decide when we want or to restore the land to?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and particularly in an estuary system like this, which is always changing. So naturally systems like this change. So we have more fresh water, we have less fresh water, we have more tides, we have less tides. And so it's a changeable environment by its very nature. I think in terms of restoring sites like this one where Trust for Nature have worked, or other sites across the lake where other people are working to improve the health of them, it's really about getting the best outcome you can with the drivers that you have at the moment. So it's recognising and understanding the environment that you're in, and that might be pressures like water extraction, it might be pressures like climate change, and these are things that are very difficult at an individual site to control. So it's about recognising the pressures that are there and then tailoring your actions on the ground to try and make the best impact you can. So if we can create habitat for beach nesting birds, then let's do that. Wetland habitat and fresh water for frogs, then let's do that. And it's about trying to find the appropriate places in the landscape to do that and not trying to create something that's setting yourself up for fail. And that's one of the challenges that all the partners have across the lakes in working together is about recognising where best to act and what are the most important things to act on.
And you've been working here for quite a while now, is that right?
Yeah, so I've been in East Gippsland for 15 years. I've had a couple of stints working for the Catchment Management Authority. I've also worked for Parks Victoria and in the private sector as well. So I've been really fortunate to be part of this industry here for a while and seen a lot of things, seen some big floods and some big fires. One thing that does continually come up is the strength of the community in this part of the world and also the strength of the NRM group. So the group of people like me and in roles like me working together towards a common goal is something that helps this region do quite well and punch above its weight, I reckon, a little bit. As I said, we're at the eastern end of the state and often a little bit isolated, as we saw over the summer period as well. So being able to lean on the people that you work with and lean on your community to help through those times and help to achieve some goals is really important.
It's now time to depart Flannagan Island. We've spent a lovely day here with Paul and Sean. A big thanks to the landowners for letting us take a tour of this beautiful island.
I hope you enjoyed coming with me to Flannagan Island and seeing a really interesting landscape and also meeting the people who are restoring it. See you next time.